Hello, I'm Dr. Parme Giuntini from Otis College of Art and Design. Today we're going to be looking at Impressionism, definitely one of the most popular movements with audiences everywhere today. You may wonder why pretty pictures of gardens and Paris streets, flowers, the ballet, and water lilies could have caused so much concern in the 19th century. That's a good place to start, and hopefully, after this lecture, you won't think of Impressionist painting as just pretty pictures anymore.
Today we will be continuing our study of modern art. Last time we talked about realism and modernity, and today we will start on Impressionism. Impressionism is one of the most popular and popularized movements of modern art. Even people who have never seen an actual canvas recognize Monet's haystacks, Renoir's carefree groups, Degas' ballerinas, and the myriad mother and child paintings by Mary Cassatt. Most of us have been surrounded by Impressionist art all of our lives, not only in museums, but in countless reproductions on posters, napkins, calendars, even umbrellas. The style seems familiar, pretty, easy to understand, and not at all controversial. It was fairly well established in Europe and in the eastern United States, in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, among wealthy collectors of modern art by 1900. The term is often used loosely today, so we should pay particular attention to what it meant in the 19th century. It is difficult for audiences now to understand the controversy that these paintings caused when they were first being exhibited in the 19th century. They seem so harmless, so pretty, and so banal in subject matter. How could pictures of gardens and boating and dances and flowers have caused such an artistic and cultural crisis for critics and audiences alike? By the mid-1870s, Paris was well established as the contemporary artistic and cultural center of Europe. The British may have dominated economics, politics, and colonial imperialism, but France, and Paris in particular, was the reigning authority on beauty and style. It was also becoming the city where the avant-garde met and worked. There, inspired and encouraged by Edouard Monet, a small group of artists, men and women, were developing a new approach to painting. The primary Impressionists were Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot, Camille Pissarro, Alfred Sisley, and Frédéric Bazille. I am going to include one more, Gustave Caillebotte, a wealthy Frenchman who supported the Impressionists, sometimes even financially, and also painted a number of works that are considered canonical today. That term Impressionism is not one that they coined, but was first noted by the Parisian art critic Jules Castagnard, who saw their work in an exhibition and was especially impressed by Monet's painting, in particular a work titled Impressionism, Sunset, that he made in 1872. The critic wrote, "If one wants to characterize them with a single word that explains their efforts, one would have to create the new term Impressionists, in the sense that they render not a landscape, but the sensation produced by a landscape." Monet's painting is typical, if not stereotypical, of what people associate with the term Impressionism. The water and sky mix in a hazy combination of blue, gold, and crimson. The small floating boats and figures are suggested rather than carefully detailed. There is no linear perspective, no true foreground, middle, or background. the entire scene appears flat. The canvas surface is textured. You can see the tiny ridges where the artist lifted his brush. What makes the painting work, surely what impressed that critic, is that what Monet painted looked like what you would see if you were standing there, on that site, at that time of day, with those exact climatic conditions. Nothing would be clearly outlined. The detail would be lost in the atmospheric haze, and the sunset would alter the colors and blur the shapes. The painting duplicated the sensation and the optical illusion, which itself was transitory and fleeting. Impressionist painting is not formulaic. It is not a style, but an approach, and the artists associated with the movement may have shared a body of practices, but the results are diverse. One way of understanding Impressionism is to use Richard Schiff's 4 categories of classification. He argues that Impressionists were 1. Part of the same socio-economic group. 2. They agreed on subject matter, which was contemporary life, both urban and country life. 3. Their techniques and practices dramatically challenged the conventions and aesthetics of academic art. Finally, 4. The Impressionist artistic goal was to capture the immediacy of sensation and experience of a particular moment under specific conditions of light and climate. That was how they defined creativity and originality. Let's start with their socio-economic background. Simply put, all of the Impressionists came from the middle class, or the upper middle class, what was called bourgeois at that time. Some, like Degas and Mary Cassatt, came from very wealthy families. They all knew each other and lived in Paris, although Cassatt was raised in the United States and Pissarro in the Virgin Islands. All of them had some formal art training, so they were very familiar with academic conventions. They understood the rules before they broke them. Living in Paris, they were accustomed to city life, walking the streets, shopping, going to the opera, the theater and ballet, enjoying leisure time in the countryside, and being able to travel. They had a lot in common with each other and with the audience they were painting for, which was also middle class. Sometimes they worked together. This is especially true of Renoir and Monet, and on occasion they exhibited together. They often advised and critiqued each other and sometimes helped each other out financially. Gustave Caillebotte was particularly helpful this way to Claude Monet. Despite their common social and economic status, it is important to remember that the cultural standards of the time, especially the rules and conventions regarding gender, made a huge difference. The men were able to go wherever they wanted and paint whatever they wanted. There were no restrictions. This was not the case for Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt. As ladies of the bourgeois class, their access to the city and to acceptable subject matter for painting was much more limited. We will be discussing this in greater detail next week. They did agree on subject matter. Impressionists painted all the categories of academic art with the exception of history, but their focus was on the contemporary world, their world, everything from overviews of new Paris streets like Pissarro's Avenue Montmartre to intimate depictions of private moments like Berthe Morisot's painting of the Cradle. If it was part of modern life, it was a viable subject for these painters. Public dances, horse races, train stations, vacation sites were all fair game. Impressionists painted their homes, gardens, friends and families, even the help. You could say that Impressionists painted popular culture. They often painted in groups traveling to seaside resorts, popular restaurants, or gardens. It is not unusual to find exactly the same subject painted at the same time by two different artists. Monet and Renoir liked to paint together early in their careers. These are two examples of paintings they made of a popular restaurant, La Grenouillère, which means the froggery, which was located on the bank of the Seine River. It was a popular place to have dinner, and both artists spent time there painting together. Similarly, both Monet and Pissarro produced a group of Parisian boulevard street scenes, painted from high vantage points on balconies. Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot concentrated on domestic life and women with children. But Renoir also made many paintings of young children and adolescents. Whether or not Impressionist art is a realistic representation of lived experience is a much harder question to answer. The movement must be read against contemporary French culture, which includes politics, war, social and economic issues, as well as critiqued from the position of race, class, and gender. The lasting popularity of Impressionist art and its acceptance among the bourgeoisie was in great part to the utopian view that it represented, the gloss that it put on modern life. In terms of formal qualities, factors like line, perspective, modeling, and finish, Impressionist painting looked dramatically different from mainstream academic work, and that caused problems for critics and audiences. It was impossible to judge the artistic quality and technique of Impressionist work because it did not correspond to the established criteria for good painting. This situation was the consequence of the Impressionist techniques and practices. To begin, many Impressionists liked to paint outdoors. This was the particular preference of Claude Monet, who for most of his professional career preferred to work on multiple canvases of the same subject, shifting from one to another as the light changed, and often working on them for days at a time. You can see this in his 1872 painting of the regatta at Argenteuil, which was a popular leisure site. Made without preparatory drawings or sketches, Monet painted directly onto the canvas, attempting to capture the shifting light and its reflections on the boats and water. This meant painting rapidly, putting brushstrokes on the canvas that matched what he was watching at the same time. Remember, that was constantly changing too. So it is not surprising that the finished painting has a sketchiness that we associate with the atmospheric conditions, the constantly moving water, and the blurred reflection. The brushstrokes are often swaths of color that are not worked or blended into the composition. Painting plein air, outside and directly on the canvas, was possible in the 1870s because of new kinds of paints. Instead of grinding their own paints, artists could buy new tubes that were very portable, easy to use, and they came in wonderful new colors: cobalt blue, a bright yellow, emerald blue-green. These new colors did not crack or dry up outside, nor did they turn muddy or brown when mixed, so Impressionist paintings really did look remarkably different from anything earlier. Of course, academic artists adopted the new paints also, and their paintings reflected this vibrant new palette. But because Impressionist works were smaller and addressed different subject matter and demonstrated different techniques, they aroused enormous attention. There were other ways in which Impressionist works were technically different. The new paints did not need to be varnished or glazed, and their surfaces were not necessarily smoothed out. It was long-standing practice for artists to hide their brushstrokes, blending in the paint well so the surface was silky. This also enabled them to depict specific surface textures like flesh or wood, metal or textiles. Jean-Léon Gerome's 1879 painting of the snake charmer demonstrates the value and appeal of this approach. He was a famous academic artist whose virtuosity in making history paintings was well established. You can clearly see the different textures of snakeskin and human flesh, the shiny glazes of the decorative tiles, the matte finish of the stone floor and the baskets. This kind of painting took a great deal of patience and skill. The presence of obvious brushstrokes would have been seen as an indication of sloppy work, and would have detracted from the finished product and its aesthetic value. Because many of the Impressionists did work quickly, their brushstrokes often showed and could look idiosyncratic. Now that's a long word to mean that they did not appear to conform to any identifiable pattern. Looking closely at details of Boulevard Montmartre on a wintry morning from 1879 will make this very clear. Today the painting is exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is one of those famous street scenes that both Pissarro and Monet liked to paint. It's done from a high vantage point on a snowy day, so the atmosphere is cloudy. The buildings, the people, the carriages, and horses are obscured by the climatic condition. Pissarro painted what he saw and how he saw it, which was somewhat fuzzy and blurry. You can see that the carriages are dashes of pink, white, blue, and orange paint. Some of it is thick, some thin. Nothing is distinct. Not a single person or horse is clearly outlined or modeled. Like the other Impressionists, Pissarro was interested in catching the immediate and transitory effects of light and shadow. Painting rapidly meant textured, rapid strokes that built up paint and left ridges. This surface texture is very familiar to you. We take it for granted now and consider it one of the aesthetic hallmarks of an Impressionist painting. But it caused consternation in the 19th century, and Impressionist paintings were often criticized because they looked unfinished or sketchy, with uneven paint, figures that were not clearly defined. They did not fit the official aesthetics of academic art, so conservative critics and collectors agreed that they looked bad, poorly painted, with little skill or technical ability. The conservative critics were very outspoken about them. One ranted that the figures in Monet's Boulevard des Capucines from 1873 looked like black spits of paint. Besides plein air work and rapid painting, many Impressionists abandoned preparatory sketches, since such a practice theoretically interfered with spontaneity. Again, preparatory sketches was established academic practice dating back to the Renaissance, when complex narratives need to be carefully plotted out. Along with the abandonment of preparatory sketches, there was an increasing de-emphasis on line. In some cases, figures appeared as just dashes of paint. This was especially true with street and crowd scenes that were often painted from high balconies, making the figures and carriages look like dashes. Adding detail would have meant substituting remembered or conscious ideas for what the artist actually saw. Now that would have been the academic solution. But think a moment. Just how much detail can you make out about a crowd from 3 or 4 or 5 stories up? Impressionists sacrificed finely worked out details, representations of specific fabrics and surface textures. Figures in crowd scenes often appeared to be in motion, with blurred outlines and indistinct shadows. Since Impressionists were interested in painting what they saw under specific conditions, they naturally had to eliminate strongly plotted compositions. Street scenes were painted from balconies, leisure sights from across rivers and lakes. What one could not see clearly was not intended to appear on the canvas. Can an artist really determine surface quality of fabrics from several hundred feet away? The exact expression on someone's face? For artists interested in capturing the impressions of reality, these were serious theoretical issues. Reality was often experienced in a blur, in motion, as a sensation. Painting the contemporary world needed to make those adjustments. Two other factors were also influential on the Impressionist style. One was photography and the other, Japanese prints. We have already talked about the impact that photography had on modern culture, because the camera was associated with documenting truth, such as this photograph of the church of Saint-Sulpice taken by Eugène Hakkei in the late 19th century. After all, it was a machine that took a picture of something that actually existed. For the Impressionists, painting what they saw as they saw it helped recreate the sensation of that moment, that particular experience. Since they painted the places and events that their audience knew and was familiar with, they expected their paintings to help recreate that experience for the viewer, even though that might involve less detail and a sketchy composition and a roughened canvas. A photograph of the street 3 stories below would have been a document. An Impressionist painting of a street like Boulevard des Capucines was a documented sensation. This is where the Impressionist emphasis on color and optical illusions factored in. Landscapes, city streets, parks, whatever the subject, they all appeared to look different depending on the time of day, the weather, the vantage point of the artist. The amount and intensity of sunlight and the climatic conditions affected the optical sensation. You have all experienced driving a car on a hot day when the road ahead seems fluid and silvery, although rationally you know that it is hard and black. The difference between painting what you saw and painting what you know to be true is a fair analogy of painting academically and painting as an impressionist. You might be surprised that Japanese prints like Armour-hanging pine, Hakkei slope by Ando, Hiroshige from 1856 were also an influence on French painting. This is typical of the kind of Japanese prints that were being imported by mid-century, which is just about the time when Japan began trading with the West. Many people in France were interested in Asian culture, and there was great enthusiasm for buying Japanese ceramics, silks, and prints. Part of what fascinated people was the different aesthetics. Japanese artists used a different kind of perspective, so the scenes appeared flatter, more linear, less detailed, and more abstracted. Combined with photography, which also produced a more flattened image, it is not surprising that some artists were intrigued by adopting a different approach to perspective. This interest in non-Western aesthetics would continue throughout the century, and part of the growing avant-garde focus on abstraction and flatness was the result. The Impressionists' focus on contemporary life and their toolkit of new painting practices and techniques was combined with one more critical factor, and that was the common interest in privileging optical effects. How people see, what they see, the differences that climate can make on vision, the invention of photography, these were all issues that intrigued the 19th century modern world and made people, including artists, question what painting was supposed to do in that modern world, what painting was supposed to show. If no single subject could look the same under different conditions of light and climate, then the most truthful, the most authentic, the most modern response would be to catch that specific moment and those particular lighting effects. When Renoir made this painting of the Moulin de la Galette, which was a popular public dance site in 1876, he wanted to show the gaiety, the crowds, the blur of dancing, but he also needed to show the play of light and shadow on the figures. the way that late afternoon sunlight decorated the clothing and hats and ground with blotches of color. He needed to show how the press of people and their constant movement made it impossible for anyone to pick out the details of clothing or expression. To accomplish all of that meant abandoning long-established methods and conventions and opting for a new, modern approach, an Impressionist approach, and a new definition of originality and creativity. This challenged academic work, which often relied on literary narratives or even academic landscapes, which could be highly imaginative. Schiff's categories are useful for talking about Impressionism, but it is important to remember that the Impressionists themselves had a variety of techniques and working habits which do not neatly fit into all of the categories all of the time. Caillebott's large painting, Rainy Day Paris from 1877, is an example of that, and quite different from the paintings that we have been looking at. His has a much more academic style, with its crisp outlines and linearity, or at least that's the impression at first glance. Then you realize that what the painter has depicted is a street scene in which the viewer is almost within touching distance of the main figures, a well-dressed couple out for a stroll. That detail rapidly disappears if you look past them, where the rain obscures the figures and buildings except for the wet, shiny cobblestones and the streets that seem to slant downward towards us. There is a sensation of motion to the painting. You almost want to step to the side, and perhaps one reason that the artist did the work on such a large scale was to enhance that sensation. I remember the first time I saw this painting in person at the Chicago Institute of Art, where it takes up an entire wall. What fascinated me was the dab of white paint with which the artist made the woman's diamond earring. That's all it is, one dab of paint meant to convey glitter and shine, not a carefully worked out sphere. That would have been too academic. So it is important to remember that Impressionist artists played with these new ideas and techniques. They experimented, looking for better ways to convey their ideas, and not at all afraid about breaking the rules or establishing new aesthetic standards. Much like contemporary inventors and capitalists, scientists and writers, they did not believe that the rules were meant to hamper them. By now you should have a better idea of the reasons that Impressionism was so seductive to the avant-garde and so problematic to the established academic standards. For modern artists interested in finding a universal approach to painting, something they thought everyone would understand, it made sense to paint contemporary subjects, since they needed no explanation, and to develop new practices to paint them the way they appeared at that particular moment. Just like new inventions and new technologies, it made sense. It was so modern. We haven't talked about the issues associated with Impressionist subjects, or the gender concerns, or how these paintings were interpreted, or why those interpretations have changed. It is also important to remember that with every modern movement that promised a universal answer to art, there were criticisms of it, and not just from the Academy. These are some of the issues that we will take up next week with Impressionism in Part 2. Thank you.
You should have a better understanding now of how Impressionist painting techniques and different subject matter challenged academic conventions and what people thought of as good art. That isn't the whole story about Impressionism, though. In the past 40 years, art historians have taken a fresh and critical look at the movement. Many of these were female art historians, or art historians interested in very different priorities with very different questions. Next time, we're going to look at what happens when new theories are developed, new questions asked, and new positions proposed about Impressionism.